Thanks to Spider-Man and the memes that came from the movie we're gonna talk about, movie internet has at least started to talk about something else other than Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey in August. That said, even though people are still lining up to see the movie, discourse around The Odyssey still eventually devolved into the same shit show since the first trailer came out, so let's talk about that. Welcome back, I'm Inigo, and in this video we'll try to figure out why this movie ended up getting a lot of hate despite not being a bad movie, and a movie that's still good enough that apparently people still line up to actually see it. By the way, this is part 2 where we'll focus on the external factors outside the movie itself that I think made people hate this movie. Part 1 talks more about the movie itself, the elements within the movie, so if you're interested in checking that out, you can check that out first and then go back to this video or open it in another tab. Link to the video in the description below. Maybe you're a movie nerd or just a numbers nerd, or you're a curious person and you're into figuring out these kinds of things like me, this is definitely the video for you. So without further ado, here's 3 more reasons why The Odyssey got so much backlash, despite being a good movie. Point number 1, Iliad and Odyssey purists and historians too. Obviously, the Odyssey is based on the Odyssey written by Homer, and it's a 3,000-year-old story with multiple versions and adaptations, and even the original in ancient Greek. So people are going to be coming into this movie with a lot of baggage already. You can't not watch The Dark Knight and not feel some kind of sadness whenever Heath Ledger comes in on screen. And you also can't not watch or think about that Alec Baldwin Western movie, Rust, knowing that someone died making that movie. A tragic death that was all preventable. So, I'd imagine if the Odyssey and the Iliad were something that you've read multiple times from way back when you were younger, you'd get defensive over the first major big budget adaptation since the 50s and 60s. I know The Return exists with Ralph Fiennes, but if it weren't for the 2026 movie, none of us would have known it existed in the first place. Let's be honest. And I know Oh Brother Where Art Thou is a loose adaptation of the Odyssey, as was the SpongeBob movie, but this was the first one that was billed as the Odyssey. So I get why if you really liked the Odyssey and you were a big fan of it, you would be a bit defensive of it. But at the same time, there's a difference between that and just eating up whatever slop they give you, like the good consumer you are, and that's also different from trying to understand where the filmmakers are actually coming from. Because even the writer whom Nolan used as a basis for the screenplay publicly disowns this movie because of the direction that Nolan took the Odyssey into, at least this version that he made. But I think that's where a huge part of the problem lies in. In my previous video I talked about how if you took the armor, costumes, and art direction away, it wouldn't look as weird if it was a stage play than if it was a movie like they did here. And I think it applies to Nolan's Odyssey too, where his narrative choices would have been a lot more well received if it were sort of like a stage play or done like 5 or 8 years ago. But since it's 2026 and this is a movie and outrage posting on social media is apparently all where we can get our dopamine from these days anymore, now everyone's decided to constantly shit on this movie whenever they can. If we're arguing on the strict adaptation of the source material, both The Odyssey and The Return actually twist and bend the original version to tell a focus story. Christopher Nolan's version telling one more on empathy and mutual respect between strangers, with The Return telling one of revenge. Both of which, by the way, have our own modern anti-war themes and message, and veteran regret or PTSD, and both of which also have the similar bare-bones, minimalist, dark costume direction and aesthetic, as if they were shades playing their part in a mythical story rather than actual people living in their homes in the current year that they lived in. The Return even has some of that DAI casting which I'm not going to get into here since I talked about that in my other videos, and yet somehow Nolan's Odyssey is the only one that gets shit for it. Look, don't get it wrong, I'm not a Nolan dick rider. I think The Odyssey is a good movie, a decent one, but it's not great either, at least based on the one and only time I was able to watch it so far. But this irrational attachment to the source material is what prevents a lot of people from taking these movies as they are and try to appreciate the story that these filmmakers are trying to tell within the context of that movie, within that bubble. If we're being honest, a 3-hour movie would never be enough to make a really faithful adaptation of the Odyssey. You need at least a 1-season miniseries, or better yet, make it a multiple season show and include the Iliad too. One of the things that makes Nolan a great filmmaker is that he understands the medium of the movie and what movies are supposed to be, which is a medium that tells these grand and engaging stories within a specific time period. not simply as an excuse and a vehicle to do live adaptations of stories, and treating the Odyssey the same as how we treat modern superhero comic books, which I think the superhero hype in the last 2 decades of movies have conditioned us to only accept adaptations if they're comic accurate or source material accurate. Part of me thinks this is a huge part of why our collective culture hasn't felt like we've moved on past the 2000s, because nobody's willing to change or build upon and actually push the plot forward. And then when somebody finally does decide to do that, like Christopher Nolan with the Odyssey and his own version of it, we shit on it because it's not comic accurate. But as great of a filmmaker Christopher Nolan is and how well he understands filmmaking, there's one big miscalculation Nolan made that helped add to the backlash and hate that this movie got, and that is... When this movie came out, there was this big divide between watching it on regular 35mm cinema and also apparently the actual 70mm real IMAX, because apparently we've all been sold a different version, like a fake IMAX, where it's not the full IMAX 70mm version that apparently is the only legit thing. Because regardless of what you think about this movie is a technical marvel that actually filmed the whole thing in 70mm IMAX throughout the entire movie. This was the first movie to actually do that. And so obviously that's going to be a lot of the marketing, but it's also elitist by nature. And I don't really like using that word, let's be real. There's no other way to describe the IMAX situation in the Odyssey other than elitist. Now, I do believe that shooting fully on IMAX was the move to go, and it's one of the great technological advances in filmmaking that this industry and this art form needed. Because of streaming, I think a lot of the movies and TV shows we have, I mean, yeah, TV elevated, but also movies got downgraded into something that's a lot more generic. And so this industry has stagnated for way too long, and I think shooting on IMAX was genuinely the way to go. But the more they marketed this movie as, you have to see this in IMAX, bro, the more it became less of the premium, most best way you can experience this movie to, if you don't watch it on true 70mm IMAX, you're a poor. And surprise, surprise, there's only about 40 cinemas in the world that have those 70mm projectors, and some of them don't even work or break down a lot. So it's really stupid if you think about it. And it wouldn't be that bad if it were the case that IMAX was just better sharpness or better image quality, but they're straight up chopping out big parts of the frame composition and marketing it as, if you don't see it IMAX, you're not getting the full experience. Like, bro, are you telling me you couldn't just print every version of this movie in the IMAX aspect ratio digitally, even for the digital version, and then we play it in the regular widescreen cinemas with some pillar boxing on the side? Like, that wasn't possible? Because what about the previous movies that had that jarring aspect ratio jump whenever it switched from regular scenes to the big action scenes shot on IMAX? We couldn't just use what we did on those as a workaround to the fact that the vast majority of cinemas in the world are in the wide aspect ratio, and IMAX screens are not that common. I wish I was just ranting about the medium and only that, you know, the framing and the composition and all of that. But what this eventually resulted in was just straight up manufactured scarcity and FOMO, whether that was intentional in their marketing or not. Because soon enough it was less about the actual story being told, which was the Odyssey, but modernized and Nolanized, than it was the spectacle of watching something on IMAX, which, to be fair, that was the point of IMAX, when that format and those cameras and projectors were made. And to be also fair, at least that kind of marketing got asses to cinema seats, which is a very hard thing to do these days. Movie ticket prices have significantly increased in the last not even 10 years since COVID, and with everything else also costing more while wages being stagnant, it's harder and harder for people to justify not only spending the actual ticket price of going to the cinema, but also taking the time out of our busy days and the overall expense of going to the movies, which double and quadruple if you're paying for more than one person. But this whole IMAX thing did show one thing: with the right selling point, people can and will still line up to the cinemas, because we may have awesome TVs at home, but none of us have IMAX, or like an actual cinema. And I think if movies play it right, IMAX would be the future of cinema. Not 3D or not, obviously not AI, but I think this IMAX treatment of making films sacred and special, that I think is the catalyst that I think would distinguish movies from just your average content you can stream on Netflix or whatever. But that's going to be another video. Because even with home cinemas, like the ones with projectors and not a huge ass TV, it's not the same as going to the cinema and watching it on IMAX, or even just going to the cinema at all. What the Odyssey did accomplish was be this highly technically impressive film that was actually worth shelling your money out for. Like, even with inflated IMAX tickets that I think are throughout the world double the price of the regular cinema tickets, people don't mind not only paying for that, but also watching that with other strangers in cinemas. And a crowded cinema too. Now, speaking of strangers, and going back to the whole hate that this movie had, it's all fake and made up. Everyone's a grifter, including myself. Like, before, social media used to be this thing where people genuinely shared their thoughts and connected with other people, but it has turned into an actual media thing, entity, if you will. But jokes on everyone else, I'm not even monetized, so right now this is more of like a journal. Anyways, based on what I know about this whole game now, a lot of people have livelihoods that are hinged upon views and getting clicks, and even in a more basic form, their validation as a people, who they are, hinge upon the posting of outrage content and jumping on bandwagons based on trending keywords and other stuff like that. Now, initially there was some valid outrage about this movie stemming from largely the costume and set design, as well as the armor that somehow everybody all of a sudden were experts at. But as soon as those initial tweets and YouTube comments came out, the game was basically on. It first started as people, harvesting a few likes and retweets, and eventually people just started dunking on this movie as if most of the internet were, again, experts in antiquity all of a sudden, able to somehow distinguish between early and late Corinthian helmet models versus Attic and Illyrian because reason. And then people started spamming about the Dendra armor, which fine, that existed in the late Bronze Age and that could have been used in the actual historical Trojan War, but we also can't know that for sure because the only surviving armor that we have are from those high status burial sites, which arguably someone like a king of Ithaca would have had. But also, two things: we can't guarantee that, one, Odysseus' troops would also have that armor, and two, that would have been the exact armor that was also used in Ithaca, since everybody made up their own shit. And Dendra, the village in Greece, is actually a long way from Ithaca. And even like the historical Ithaca from the myths isn't necessarily the same Ithaca as in the Odyssey itself during the Mycenaean era. And going back to like the uniformity of armor, even in the Roman Empire and the production of armor and clothing, especially when it came to the legion, was fairly standardized, it wasn't the same throughout. Like, there were lots of variations, and some regions of the empire followed one pattern while others followed another. 3,000 years ago wasn't the same interconnected world we have right now, where I can literally download a 3D model from somewhere in the world and print it exactly to how that original maker wanted it to be printed at. Like, people did their own things. And if you were separated by more than a few days of travel, and people didn't travel that often, things would fall in and out of fashion and you wouldn't even know about it. But see, if you do read history and have at least some genuine interest in it outside of like the required readings from school, you'd understand this concept called nuance. And that same nuance was left out of the table when all the normies started fighting out about this movie all over Twitter because Dendra armor. And speaking of Dendra armor and Twitter, that's basically where all of this really took off. When Demon Flying Fox AI'd the first trailer of the Odyssey to have historically accurate armor, I assumed based on the comments that he saw on the first trailer of the Odyssey and released on YouTube, that Demon Flying Fox video had historically accurate armor, which I admit did look cool, especially like the Hades shots. And I think this would have worked better if the shades looked kind of like this, or like a bit more CGI, like in the Army of the Dead in the Return of the King, and not just people smeared with volcanic ash. But going back to the Demon Flying Fox video, people applauded that for being historically accurate. The same people who also didn't realize that it had a lot of inaccuracies in there too. First off, not everyone would have had the same exact armor back in the day, because again, nothing was standardized, and even in the classical era, which is the early Iron Age, or like the proper Iron Age, the Greeks customized their armors a lot. It wasn't only until like the Roman era where people actually wore the same exact armor, and even then you'd have customizations here and there. So in the Mycenaean civilization, we can't know it for sure, but most historians would agree that armor wouldn't be that uniform. And also, not everyone would have the same high-end expensive armor. Like, a few people would have this Dendra armor in like its full set. Second, these Pentaconter ships, or like these ships with these aren't triremes. Triremes are basically the same ship but bigger and have 3 rows of rowers. This one just has one row and I think like 50 people, hence the name Penteconter. These ships didn't exist until Homer's time, or at least like I think shortly after Homer's time. And I touched on this in the previous video as well. The actual construction of Viking longships versus the Mediterranean types, that's probably the big difference, but Viking longships do visually look a lot closer to what they actually had in the Bronze Age and what Odysseus would likely have had right about this time, especially when naval warfare was still boarding other ships and not ramming them, which would originate in ancient Egypt, but that's another video. This shot of the Trojan warrior is completely made up as well, because horses did exist, but horses didn't exist like that at the time. People didn't ride them on horseback. Horses were a lot shorter. There's a reason why the Iliad always mentions chariots, and again, nobody rode on horseback, let alone used stirrups. And that trailer pretty much ended on the Hades shot, which again, I think was cool as fuck. But that's all this footage really was, is a test shot and proof of concept answering the question, what if Odyssey had historically accurate armor? Now, the good news is, there's a good enough demand for people who want to actually see that thing. The bad news is that that trailer completely disregarded all other aspects of history, like disregarding what Ithaca in general would have looked like, or even Troy. Things like the clothes that Penelope and Telemachus would have worn, you know, the daily life stuff that if you genuinely cared about historical authenticity like movies like Master and Commander did, those are the details you would be fighting for, not Madendra armor. Which is why I'm not really putting Demon Flying Fox on blast for this, because that is the point of his channel. What if X but Y reimagined with AI? But that video also wouldn't have gone viral if the masses weren't so easily baited into outreach like this. Also, I know Demon Flying Fox was capitalizing on this trend because the trailer for the Odyssey came out on December 23 and this reimagined trailer came out a literal couple of days later. Now, the main flaw of this whole grifting based on attention economy is that there ends up being no real analysis or examination of things, as the content we all produce are just largely reactive only. This is fully embodied in that Demon Flying Fox video because what did they actually end up doing? Just switched up the armor into something that it isn't in the movie, and that's all where that conversation started and ended on. And because of the fast news cycles these days, it always begins and ends to the point that you're trying to make, which is why we're all mad about everything all the time, because we're all being introduced all of these problems and issues and no resolution to any of them. Again, this goes beyond the Odyssey, but the Odyssey broke 1 billion at the box office, in spite of all of the hate that this movie got from content creators, like from people just dunking on this movie. And about that hate, turns out it was still a very small minority who were constantly talking about these things. Look, make no mistake, the Odyssey made that much because at the end of the day, it was still a good movie that was worth going out for and spending the time and money to watch it. Not because of like the creative choices. I think the criticisms were valid because Hollywood did pivot towards being accurate to who you're representing, but then suddenly when it's ancient Greek culture, they switch on the DEI stuff and just cast whoever. Like, yeah, the criticisms were valid. But again, in my previous video, I'd made this distinction between those kinds of choices coinciding with the deliberate decision to make what is essentially slop garbage, mediocre movies, and Hollywood expecting us to foot the bill every single time. But in spite of all the hate, what's different with the Odyssey is that, again, it was actually a good movie, unlike 99% of the outrage content from the movies that we grifters and content creators dogpile on. So those are the 3 more things I think outside the movie, affected like the perception of the Odyssey. I really don't know how to end this video other than to remind you to form your own opinions, understand that a lot of the talk online is done by a small minority of people, though that loud voice still can influence the market and people at large. And I'd like to leave you with this one question. With all the flack on historical authenticity this movie got, what are we even doing? Are we even allowed to have our own takes and unique versions or adaptations of older stories anymore? Does everything have to be historically accurate, just like every superhero movie has to be comic book accurate, even at the cost of the story being told? Why can't movies just be fun and be a good time anymore? Or do all movies have to insist upon themselves in an attempt to shame us to fork up our hard-earned money just so the people making these movies not go broke? Anyways, that's it for me for now. If you've enjoyed the video, do check out the other stuff in my channel. This would probably be the last Odyssey video I'll make in the channel for a while. I want to cover other stuff, like in other movies and games too. So do check out the other stuff in my channel, and if you like to sub, consider turning on the bell notification so you'll know every time I upload. Again, that's it for me for now. I am Inigo, signing off for now. Bye!